Well, let's get going. And thank you all for showing up on a Friday afternoon during the holiday season. I hope we will make this worth your while. Here we have a new book. It's called Asia's Alliance Triangle, U.S.-Japan-South Korean Relations at a Tumultuous Time. And what we want to do is introduce the book. It's compiled from articles in the Asan Forum during the first 2 years. We now are 2.5 years old, this journal. And there's a secret about this journal which I don't think I've ever passed on to anyone, and that is we're not only looking for individual articles and not only trying to get in our special forum every 2 months a combination of 5 articles and an introduction and something integrated through this. We're also aiming for some cumulative effect on sub-regional and other topics. And so here we found that putting together the articles of the first 2 years in such a fascinating time for Japan-Korea-U.S. relations, that we could group them and look at the connections among them and come up with a book that we think is where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so I'm delighted. Joining me are 2 of the contributors and who've done a great deal to help this journal move forward. And in a moment I will turn to them and they will be making remarks. But I want to say something more about this triangular relationship and what I think this book demonstrates. I wouldn't say that it is it reveals, because I think others are aware of that. And the first thing I will say about it is that the usual stories we've heard about this triangular relationship and its 3 legs are often misleading. That something else has been operating over this 2-year period, and we get caught up in narratives about South Korea-Japan relations being largely about history and comfort women. And now they're on the mend as they put that overall problem somewhat aside and prioritize other things. And U.S.-Japan relations, well, there was the Yasukuni Shrine issue, and the U.S. has been concerned that Japan hasn't, and South Korea haven't been dealing enough with their bilateral issue, complicating our trilateral needs. But that is, the idea the U.S.-Japan relationship is the best ever, has been widely stated, and there's some reasons to raise questions about it, while at the same time reinforcing that overall impression in some respects. And of course, a big theme over these last 2.5 years has been that the U.S.-Korea relationship is the best ever. And it's a little puzzling how 2 bilateral relationships can be the best ever, and yet the U.S. management of this triangle has been very messy and complicated. And so what should we agree with the overall narrative? And I would say the overall narrative right now, hear what others say, is that security has finally trumped history. We got over this 70th anniversary or 50th anniversary year, and economics, not a problem really here, and history is somewhat brushed aside enough so that security dominates. And now the North Korea has brought the U.S. and South Korea so closely together, and China has brought the U.S. and Japan so closely together, and we can sort of expect this continuing closeness. Well, at least I think we have to be asking lots of questions and questioning, do we understand the dynamics of this triangle and of each of the parts of it? And one thing I would say is this period under Prime Minister Abe and President Park Geun-hye has been a fascinating period. It's been a tumultuous period. It's been a period where month by month there have been developments in their bilateral relations, in their activities with surrounding countries, in the way the U.S. has had to be challenged in dealing with this relationship. We've seen just so much happen, so I think it is intensely scrutinizing it is very worthwhile. I also think that our approach has been putting together these articles from different issues is we're seeing how things are viewed at each point along a continuum of time. How do we understand these relations as they were evolving? And so I would say I don't think there's any similar book that gives us a running commentary, no similar book that concentrates on this bilateral relationship over a short period of time, important time period of time, that is as balanced and giving Korean views, Japanese views, U.S. views, drawing sometimes through synopses on broad discussions that have taken place about this relationship, and had such an impressive group of contributors who really have expertise in what they were writing about. So we haven't tried to provide an introductory book to the Japan-Korea relationship, but really specialized analyses over this extended period of how the relationships have evolved. And so obviously the question is, now what will happen to this relationship? And are we going to be able to solidify the triangle in a major way in the next year or two? And I would think that we will to some degree. But I think a lot depends on China and even on Russia, because U.S. tensions with Japan over Russia are still visible. U.S. tensions with Korea over China may have quieted a little, but they're visible. And North Korea can have an impact. Right now, it's serving to bring countries together, but it has at various times over the last decade driven them apart as different strategies towards North Korea come to the forefront. So really, it is a region-wide environment in which this triangle operates, you might say a triangle within a hexagon. And thinking about it from different angles. And I'm just delighted that people have contributed such interesting pieces. I'll just conclude these introductory remarks before we hear from the other two speakers, and then we have an exchange and entertain your questions by saying that this is the first of what we see as a number of books from articles in the Asan Forum, where there is also the possibility of integrating and building on linked articles from different issues. So the second book has been accepted, and it'll start on the pipeline, and that is Asia's Southern Tier, Southeast Asia, emphasizing ASEAN, India, and Australia as they connect to East Asia. And then we have Asia's Northern Tier ready for submission. You'll see in the newest issue of Asan Forum Online, which will be complete within sometime next week, that we have a series of articles that will be part of this book, and that is Sino-Russian relations, Mongolia, and North Korea in the context of Northern Tier. And then a fourth book is being planned with more of a stress on Korea. And all of these will be co-edited books with people who are contributing to them. Well, having said that, let me turn now to, I guess, Sheila, you're next, right?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, and Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the leading experts on Japanese foreign policy, and someone who knows Japan in the context of China, Korea, and the United States very well. Sheila.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with both of you and to celebrate the publication of this new book. It looks fantastic. I haven't had a chance to read all the essays yet, but I think it's going to be an excellent, not introduction to the region, but really analysis of this particular time that we live in. And I think these years are really quite fascinating in many ways. And I think Gil's actually right not to push an introduction or a conclusion yet, because I think things are still evolving. I wrote an essay at the time, and the essay that I wrote it in May of 2014. So here we are, 2015, about quite to the end of 2015, considerably past the time. I went back and read the essay in preparation for today, and I thought, oh my gosh, I was writing at the time, just before the Hague Summit. So just before that moment when President Park, Prime Minister Abe, and President Obama sat down together at The Hague. And it was the first time, I think, that you saw the United States get actively involved, including the President, get actively involved in trying to, what I say, facilitate rapprochement, at least, if not mediate, at least to help the two leaders in Japan and South Korea overcome some of the domestic challenges and the resistance that they had faced. I look back at the period in between, and I think about what's changed since then, and there's a couple things I think have changed. I think, I raised this question in the article about what is the U.S. role in reconciliation diplomacy, and I think it's important for us. We're deep into it in the last several years, but take us back 5 years, 10 years, we would never have assumed that the United States had a role in reconciliation diplomacy, and so this is new territory, first of all. Japan and South Korea have had ups and downs over issues of history and war memory, the legacies of war and occupation, colonization, but we've never been a direct player in that bilateral dialogue. So this is the first time for the United States to think consciously about what our policy is, what it ought to be, and what role we may or may not play in terms of helping the two countries think about the past and the future. So that's an interesting point. Have we solved it? No, we know that this is a continuing challenge for both South Seoul and Tokyo, and also for the United States. I'm not sure that we are done with history, even though the 70th anniversary is coming to a close. But I think that this is a role that the United States is going to have to think about ourselves in terms of what our objectives are in the region and the role that the legacy of history plays in the way we interact with the region as well. I think it's been interesting to watch over the last several years, though, and this is something Gil brought up in his remarks, that it's become obvious that it's not just about one president, right, or one prime minister. It's really about how deeply embedded some of these issues are in the domestic politics in each society. And I touched upon this lightly in the article. Others have continued to write about it in the last couple of years, but it's no longer the case that the government in Seoul can negotiate with Japan without reference to the not only citizen opinion, but also the courts, to other ways of adjudicating these issues inside South Korea. So South Korean citizens today are also advocating within their own society and politics in ways that they have not in the past. And that affects the diplomatic options, I think, for any leader in Seoul. I think likewise in Japan over these last several years, maybe not to the same extent, and we can certainly talk about that, but you've also seen a lot more deeply engaged activism on the Korea issue in Japan in ways that you hadn't in the past. We can all go over Japan-Korea relations or the history of Koreans in Japan, and you'll find some of the roots of the current attitudes on the critical of South Korea today in Japan. But it has now, the issue of Korean relations has been appropriated by those who are openly revisionist in terms of their historical perspective. It has been embedded in that broader historical activism that we didn't see, in ways that we haven't seen, I think, in the past. So I think there's different domestic climates in which leaders in both countries have to think about this relationship that weren't there before. I think it's also not only at home, but it's also true that both governments are using different venues abroad. So it's not just that the governments of South Korea and Japan are coming to the United States to advocate their positions, but also you're beginning to see it bleed over into venues such as the United Nations. We saw it in the World Heritage Site conversation So there's an advocacy here that's going on behalf of some of the resolution of these war legacy issues or opposition to positions on these war legacy issues that has now become part of the global conversation, right, about the past and about the norms of today. So I think that's important to note. On the positive side, you also see now private actors on both sides taking a slightly different perspective. And I think on the issue of the Comfort Women, the NGO that had been advocating on behalf of the women has also entered in a much more proactive stance in terms of going to Tokyo and having conversations in Tokyo about a possible resolution. I think you've also seen that private Japanese companies, especially for the court cases on the POWs, have taken a more proactive stance on what they might do, not just the government, but what they might do to address the grievances as well. Positive, is it complete? No. But it's still something we shouldn't overlook, that this is not just about a resolution by governments, it's also a resolution by other kinds of actors. The US debate, as I sat in Washington over the last couple of years and watched, you tend to end up with a broad range of opinion on what the US role ought to be. Some people are less comfortable with the facilitator role, and they want a more active US mediation. And when you push people, I am not one of those people, and I don't say that without respect for that position. It's just that I am a little less convinced that the United States can force mediation or real reconciliation. I think that belongs to the people of Japan and South Korea. So I tend to sit advocate in the kind of ground that we can facilitate, but we really can't solve the problem, right? But I do think that people, when they talk about mediation, feel a little bit like the United States should go to Japan and tell them what to do, or go to Seoul and tell them what to do. It tends to end up with a much more enforcement kind of idea of mediation, not the real kind of sense that we're going to be able to come to some middle ground that both the government in Seoul and the government in Tokyo can agree upon. I do think that we're watching over time. I was interested, Gil, in your introduction, you said that security has trumped history, and I'm not sure that I would go that far. I think the security or strategic value of the relationships have come back to being appreciated and articulated on all three sides. But I don't think the history issues have gone away. So the question now is, how do you live with a strategic relationship and strategic interests while at the same time trying to address this question of reconciliation? I think in the diplomatic side, clearly the trilateral defense talks between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington have gone back on track. There's some limitations still, but there's a fairly good sense of confidence that that conversation is back on track. I'm not sure when it gets to the bigger questions, such as you suggested, the rise of China, right? The real serious long-term questions looking forward about how are these alliances going to affect or change or shape the regional order. I don't think we're there yet. So on the mechanics of defense cooperation, yes, we're back. But on the larger strategic issues, I think we still have some limitations here as long as the reconciliation is incomplete. So the 70th anniversary was an interesting stage this last year. And I think when again, back in 2014, we were looking at the trilateral meeting between President Park and Obama and Prime Minister Abe. But all the diplomacy of this year was bilateral, right? So there was the Abe visit to Washington. And then there was supposed to be President Park's visit in June that then got postponed because of the MERS. And then we were all witnessing and watching Xi Jinping's 70th anniversary commemoration. And then in the end, of course, President Park came in October. The bilaterals were somewhat a venue for the U.S. to make sure that each of the visiting dignitaries, especially Prime Minister Abe and President Park, moved a little closer to talking about what were the conditions under which improvement in their bilateral relationship could happen. Prime Minister Abe did not, in his congressional speech, of course, address the Comfort Women issue directly. And some in South Korea were quite critical of that. But he did stand next to President Obama and side by side reiterated a position that he'd taken inside Japan, which was that he would uphold the Kono Statement, and he had no intention of reviewing it or revising it. So the stage of the United States and the bilateral summits were then an important place to reiterate and emphasize for the global audience, right, positions that had been taken but were still somewhat not believed. Similarly, when President Park came, I was very impressed when she gave a speech, when she gave her talk at CSIS, There was a question, of course, about Japan. She didn't really go into it in her speech, but when she was asked, which was a prepared ask, of course, you know, she was quite ready to talk about the need to improve the bilateral relationship with Japan, and she also referenced the comfort women who are still alive and how their needs need to be addressed. That somehow this problem continues to be a problem of people who are living, and they must not be forgotten. So I think she managed to talk a little bit about what many people had hoped, which is the diplomacy would move forward, but she didn't step back, I think, and rightly so, from the question of what these women ought to have received or receive from the Japanese government. So I don't know. My scorecard here is the story is yet to end. I don't think reconciliation is complete. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not sure that even if, and I think it's a big if, even if you got an agreement that addressed directly the women who are still alive today, who were forced to work in Japanese military brothels, I'm not sure that would be the end of the historical legacy questions, right? It's not really the end of the story. And I think as you look across Northeast Asia, not just in the Korea-Japan relationship more broadly, the question of what happened in the past and how it affects how these countries interact in the future is going to continue to come back over and over again. I don't think it's somewhere we're going to punctuate with it's done and therefore let's move on. It is part and parcel, I think, of the dialogue about the future order, especially in Northeast Asia.
I would just add, when I was referring to the sort of conventional wisdom that we have just passed the history danger point, and now we've reached a kind of consensus on security, and we should be pleased that I too don't share that notion.
I thought so. I just wanted to.
In fact, the final section of this book is about national identities, and that to understand the Japan-Korea relationship, and indeed their relationships with the United States, one has to talk about not just the history sources, but other sources of an identity gap. And I would go as far as to say that I think what Abe represents is a kind of ideology that is being advocated. And in both Japan and Korea, Japan increasingly so, Korea from long back, the other country is a huge focus for your own national identity. And the idea that you widen the gap with the other country as a country that can't share your identity makes it much harder for this relationship to improve. But also on the security dimension, I do think we have to be aware of how significant the China factor is now and how divisive it is in Japan-Korea relations. And I think that comes through in some of the readings in this book. On Sheila's point about thinking of from different angles, I agree that the NGO factor on both sides, the interest groups, and Japan now has very strong groups advocating for the revisionist perspective, and that brings Korea right into it, including the Hate Korea movement that has been so visible in Japan recently. And then the battle in the United States. I don't think enough could be made of how intense in the last 2 years the battle between Korean and Japanese spokespersons, including diplomats, has been to win over U.S. public opinion to the disadvantage of both sides, because the U.S. side really wasn't interested in choosing one or the other, or accepting the historical argument as more important than the security argument. And so there's a lot about that in this book, and also in articles that weren't included in this book in the Asan Forum. And finally, I would say, I think we are trying to come up with that scorecard Sheila referred to, and neither she nor I thinks we're very close to having a final round. We're still in the middle of things, although these past 2 years have been extremely interesting, and we've seen how the divisions have become clearer, despite the fact that we wished we were back to an earlier era of simpler relations, where the U.S. expected more deference from each side, and we could not have to become either a mediator or a facilitator, as it turned out. Well, let's turn to Chae-gang, who has been so active in analyzing Korea-Japan relations and comes from the Asan Institute, where he is a leader in analyzing all the issues that relate to international relations. Dante.
Thank you, Gil. Actually, I have to express my deepest thanks to Gil for editing all these articles, actually. I thought he never sleeps. Whenever I turn in my draft, he just returned in within 24 hours with all read. Amazing to get it back in 24 hours. So without his dedication or efforts, it was not possible to have this book today, actually. Asan is so much grateful for his hard work, and also he's very fortunate to have him as a chief editor of Asan Forum. So I think he deserves a big round of applause. And also, having said that, my article is about 2.5 years old. So actually, whether it's still valid or not, I think some points are still valid. So of course, so it's kinds of word cliche nowadays. It could be better than this. So, is that true? Actually, I think there's some turbulence for the past 2.5 years between the United States and South Korea. But Lee Myung-bak period actually was one of the best period, I think, not because of all the outcome, but because the previous administration got the worst period in the history, Nomuyon Bush. That was the worst period. So my article was about this lessons we have learned during the Nomuyon period, and then just came into this Lee Myung-bak. So in the scorecard, actually, U.S. may feel very good about the relations. When you look at the scorecard, I don't know what kind of things U.S. actually could get from the Lee Myung-bak, except all the rhetoric. Of course, the U.S. actually got what he wanted in previous administration. Normally, did all the fantastic things for the U.S. Relocation of base, SMA, all the hard issues were resolved during the Nomuyon period. But actually, the driver for that, the resolution, was actually South Korea was desperate to become a rather independent, actually, from the United States. Their perspective is quite different from the previous administration, like Kim Dae-jung or Kim Yong-sam. So more, the term self-reliant defense or balance in Northeast Asia. Those are the terms that were very popular during the Nomuyon. So actually, South Koreans recognized how much we paid for that, for those narratives. So become more realistic. Then Lee Myung-bak came in and improved the relations with the United States drastically. So there's no daylight almost every dimension, except in Japan at the last period of Lee Myung-bak. Actually, when Lee Myung-bak went to Tokyo, and then we were not able to agree on the comfortable issue again. Always we demand the state responsibility, legal responsibility. So that was the beginning of the worsening relations between Korea and Japan, and also that's the one. But actually, there's some recommendation I made in that article. Among other things, I want to underscore one thing. So we have to look at the cognitive foundation of the alliance. That covers how we view North Korea, how we view China. Those are two most fundamental cognitive foundations for maintaining or expanding the alliance into the future. Why there's some such difficulties between the United States and South Korea during the Nomuyon period? Because actually they have totally different view on North Korea. Each one has different perspective and objective in dealing with North Korea. So that was the beginning of the split between the United States and South Korea. Lee Myung-bak period was really good because it seems to me there was no daylight in the cognitive aspect of North Korea. But if you talk about the current relations, I think there could be some difference between the United States and South Korea, especially on China issue. So of course, we have actually, it's ironic to see President Lee period was one of the worst periods in our relations with China. That phrase coming from China, because they got the best period during the Norman administration. So it's kind of ironic. Always alternate. Best for U.S., worst for China. Best for China and worst for U.S. These kinds of things. But actually, we have to manage the relations. So Park Geun-hye administration inherited the basic the problems from the previous administration. Lee Myung-bak was not able to solve the comfortable issue. So unfortunately, Park Geun-hye administration inherited. But from the beginning, of course, every president of South Korea in his inauguration, or only his inauguration, said, I want to put the past behind us. I want to improve our relations with Japan. We are the partner for future, all good words. But history comes back. As Sheila mentioned, it's a domestic issue. No one can overcome these domestic factors whenever it comes to this all history issue. This bandwagoning phenomena is widespread, not only in Korea, but also in Japan as well. So I have many good Japanese friends. When we talk about security issue, there's no daylight. We are almost everything. But when it comes to this history issue, they say, I understand, but we have our own position. You have to understand Japanese approach, Japanese position. So, but on the other, I also have to ask my Japanese friends, you have to understand the feeling we got. There's a big difference between Korea and Japan. Japan is emphasized too much on legal aspect of this issue. Korea is emphasizing too much on emotional issue. Sometimes we must be realistic and rational in dealing with the issue. But actually, we are the victims. We say, we are the victims, so you guys understand the feelings, emotions the victims got from this. So, but actually, over the past 2.5 years, I think we paid the price, and also we got the lesson. So that's why the current administration is taking two-level approach. Why having a dialogue with Japan on comfortable issues? We have had 11 rounds of this Director General level meeting, but I assume there could be more than 20 meetings ahead of us, because there's parallel. Japan cannot accept the legal responsibility or state responsibility on this issue, but we are demanding on that. I don't see any possibility for immediate resolution on that issue as well. But on the other side, like South Korea has started to resume as a dialogue with Japan within the frame of trilateral dialogue on security cooperation. So I think trilateral security cooperation dialogue have been held twice. I think the third is on its way. So we are in a better position. We have resumed our bilateral talks with Japanese counterpart and military as well. So when I talk to our military generals or the flag officers, they clearly recognize the necessity of having good working relations with Japan as well. Because actually we are indirectly connected to each other, because under the UNC, United Nations Command Framework, Japan is a real area force supplier. It's very critical for South Korea to have Japanese support on that. On the other hand, Japan needs to have the stability of the Korean Peninsula. South Korea is assuming a great role in maintaining stability on the Korean Peninsula. So both needs the other side. It finally clearly recognize it. Of course, if you come down to more technical level, for example, if you want to have an information sharing framework that's called the GSOMIA, or the acquisition or the supply assistance program like AXA, that's more of a technical problem. But still, we have some way to go to realize that we want all those two things, but the mood is better, because actually we have finally recognized the practical necessity of having a good working relations with Japan and security framework. But the other factor has just come in. That's a China factor. What would be the Chinese response if we have a closer cooperation with Japan within the framework of trilateral security cooperation? China has been very flatly said that that is designed to contain China. Of course, but on the other hand, we actually justify the trilateral security cooperation. It is not designed to contain China. It is designed to prevent North Korea from taking any kinds of aggressive action vis-a-vis South Korea. It is designed to maintain peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. That's the main thrust of our argumentation in defending the Trilateral Security Cooperation. Whether those arguments will be is accepted by Chinese or not, I have to check by Chinese colleague. But actually, my conversation with Chinese colleagues, they say, oh, this is designed to contain China. Actually, they say, oh, it's always the U.S. skin is behind all this. But for us, actually, it's necessary for us to have this trilateral. And there are other things like that, but it's quite ironic to see. When we talk about the global issues with my Japanese counterpart, we can agree on almost everything, of the humanitarian assistance to other third parties, or peacekeeping operation in Africa, or health. We were able to agree almost everything. But when it comes to regional issue, it's not impossible, but difficult to reach an agreement. But actually, there's room for both Korea and Japan to move ahead. Also, that includes the United States, like a sub-regional security dialogue, including all six parties, or maybe including Mongolia. That's the NAPSI one, but whether NAPSI has future or not, we'll see what will happen. The Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, that's nothing new, but actually it's about 20 years old initiative. But anyhow, the Park Geun-hye administration is putting a huge resource in realizing that diplomatic resource. So we will see that one. But the China factor is very critical here. But the regional things also, I always go for, we have to take indirect approach in realizing trilateral security cooperation at three levels: peninsula, regional, global. So actually we have to indirect approach starting from global, then coming down to regional. That would help both countries to build trust in each other. So we are not pursuing the anti-Japanese campaign, we are not pursuing anti-Korean campaign, but there's a political mood will actually matter a lot in the future. Actually, the South Korea, there's positive goals of enthusiasm for improving the relations with Japan in South Korea. I don't know whether Sheila can agree with me or not, but you know more than I do about Japan. When I was in Japan a couple of times last month, I was really surprised by the lack of enthusiasm in improving the relations with going to South Korea and Japan. Really. Public has no interest at all. Some export, okay, understand, but okay, there are more bigger problems. So, and also U.S. There's a U.S. role. Maybe U.S. cannot mediate, but actually U.S. can bring those two countries together to talk about some other common issues, as President Obama did on Hague. So that's a possibility. Of course, U.S. cannot sit aside and remain idle in doing anything. So of course, there's a dispute, but actually encouraging the cooperation on this non-traditional security dimension would be very helpful for both Korea and Japan, and also for the United States. So U.S. should be more consistent in managing its relations with both allies and more active. But there's some roles U.S. can play always. But actually, I hate to see the South Koreans come to Washington and try to win the minds of Americans, and the Japanese come to Washington to win the mind. But that's a kind of really counterproductive. I talk to my Japanese Gaimusho people and say, stop that kind of public diplomacy activities. If you spend 1/10 of your budget in carrying out public diplomacy in Seoul, we would be much better position. And also, I talk to my foreign ministry guys also, you should do more public diplomacy activities in Tokyo, not in Washington, D.C. So maybe we have to think about this thing. But actually, also the role of NGO is very critical. So there's a good people with great mind. Also, they have many opportunities to get together to come up with a good recommendation. So grassroots movement takes a long time, but actually that's the way we can consolidate the foundation of bilateral relations between Korea and Japan. Also, it's very necessary between the two countries, I mean the U.S. and Korea, to consolidate this grassroots foundation of the partnership for future.
I would just reinforce 2 points before we toss this out for your questions and comments and more responses from our group. The first is, despite the fact that there have been 11 meetings to talk about the comfort women issue, I consider it inconceivable that Abe will say that it's state responsibility but legal responsibility, because that is so contradictory to the ideology he's been advancing and his movement's been advancing for 20 years. They may try to finesse it in some way with some payment mechanism, but actually to acknowledge that, that's why the national identity is so important. It's just, it flies in the face of what Japan is trying to do. And so it is a real puzzle why Japan has shown so little enthusiasm for trying to find a way forward with South Korea. It worked so closely with the United States in Southeast Asia and Asia's southern tier, all the way to India and Australia. And yet if you say, how much cooperation has there been on South Korea, or on Russia for that matter of late, it's a puzzle, and it makes us have to rethink about the nature of this relationship. And then, of course, the China-South Korea issue is always there in the background, and how Seoul can continue to finesse, and with this honeymoon notion of Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye have this very, promising relationship that's going on, and yet the U.S. image of Xi Jinping is so different, and how this plays out in our relationship. So these are issues that deserve reinforcement. Sheila?
Just a couple of thoughts, and it again, we can continue in the Q&A session, but I think one of the challenges there's a Japanese government position, first of all, right? And then there's the Japanese broader sentiments about South Korea. And I think you can, if you disaggregate those, just like you disaggregate in South Korea, you'll get very different and a much more complex picture of how the two countries and the two peoples feel about each other. So I think there's a lot of latitude. I may have a slightly different take, Gil, than you, because I don't give Abe all of the credit for the current politics, to be honest. He's certainly been symbolic of the nationalist revisionist position and continues to be personally sympathetic. But he has not necessarily always acted that way as prime minister, and I think we ought to give him credit where credit is due. I do think that the politics in Japan today don't lend themselves to one singular unifying position, even on the side of the conservatives. And that's one of the things where I think most of us in the Japan field need to do a little bit more research. There's a lot more texture today, I think, in Japanese conservative opinion that we haven't really factored in. I think we're still talking in these, as you say, the geometry of these relationships, and I think the domestic piece of this is a little bit more complicated maybe than we're giving it credit for today. That being said, I think the rise of China in Tokyo is seen as the overriding geostrategic challenge. It just is. And I'm not sure, but I suspect that that's similarly the case in Seoul. Does that mean that Japan, South Korea can't come to accommodation because? I don't know. But I think it's kind of overshadowing the interpretation of how the importance of the priorities of both governments at the moment. So that makes, you'll talk to Japanese diplomats and they'll say, well, Park Geun-hye is leaning too much to China. Yeah? But then when you talk to them about the Japan-Korea relationship, they say, well, we got to deal with China. So I think there is just a reality today that there is this big shadow, and countries in the region, including the United States, are still grappling with how do we think about it, and how much reordering does this mean in terms of our relationship?
One of the agreements that we were able to reach when I was in Tokyo, we should talk about China.
Yeah.
So what Japan thinks China, what Korea thinks China.
Right.
There's a gap.
Yeah.
But we have to narrow the gap.
Yeah, exactly.
And realistically, and not just only between Korea and Japan, but also between Korea and the United States.
Right.
Very much. South Korea should clarify its position in China. I think over the past couple of months, South Korea has become much more clear on its position of South China Sea. As you can see, the statement made by Minister Han Ming-gu at ADMM Plus, and also President Park Geun-hye's statement on the EAS. Actually, we are against militarization of South China. of the islands and also the peaceful resolution. All this is actually, we are more forthcoming in expressing our own position on this issue and also under the fact sheet of the recent summit took place in Washington,
Right.
we underscore the liberal international order.
Right.
That's the thing. Actually, if there's actually more common element between Korea, Japan, and the United States than between Korea and China. Korea and China, the Korea and China share the only one thing, market economy. That's it. Of course, Chinese economy, not full market economy. We have some problem and access to market in China and IPR, all the problems. But there are more common elements among ourselves, like human rights, democracy, freedom, all these things, the values shared among ourselves. That's a strong foundation for these three countries, whereas China has become more problem. Of course, we have more problems with China nowadays. For the past 20 years, our relation with China has been so much remarkable. China has become #1 trading partner of South Korea. We need Chinese, of course, you have heard all this. We have to have Chinese cooperate in dealing with North Korea. See, that's fact. But beneath that, actually, we have more problems with China. Fishery dispute, the dispute over EEZ, and dispute over the EODO, things like that. When we try to build our naval base in Jeju Island, one of the selling points was always, it's very necessary for South Korea to have naval base in Jeju Island to take care of this island. I don't know what's island or it's LTE, low tide elevated one. We regard that's our own territory. But actually, its administrative right is granted, not the jurisdictional rights over that one. At any rate, we regard that. So, if you recall the air defense identification drone incident, that actually reflects how we feel China nowadays. So, but that kind of message has not been clearly delivered to the Japanese public and maybe the U.S. public. So maybe if we have a dialogue among ourselves on China, there could be more common understanding and also trust in each other.
Well, let's turn it to the floor. Please direct your questions at whichever person you have in mind and identify yourself. Yes.
Hi, my name is Michael Bakalu of Korea University, and my question is primarily directed to Mr. Cheng. So in the coming decade, the Japan-South Korea Northern Continental Shelf and Southern Continental Shelf agreements will be expiring. Do you see prospective negotiations over that as more of an opportunity or a challenge for Japan-South Korea relations in the 2020s?
That's really challenging one because actually whenever we have some discussion or dialogue on that issue or the drawing the line on the EEZ, it's a controversy. I'm expecting maybe some kind of turbulence will take place inevitably. Whatever you do is inevitable to have some dispute, and also the public will go crazy on this issue. This is an issue we cannot make any concession to Japan. Maybe I don't know what will be the Japanese response on that. So it is necessary to have a strong the government leadership in carrying out the negotiation and actually the extension of the agreement. That was the case of the previous Kim Dae-jung. There was a strong resistance coming from domestic audience about the fishing agreement with Japan. So because it involved Tokdo and Ulleung-do, where we can draw the line, that was very controversial. But it was political leadership. We actually were able to carry out the negotiation and conclude negotiation. So of course there was a very strong resistance. Of course, if we have a very good relations with Japan by that time, that would help definitely.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Im Kyung-yeon from Heritage Foundation. I'd like three questions to each panelist. First question is to Dr. Rozman regarding the coordination among three countries is crucial to this area. How can three countries define the existence of Russia this area? And second one is about the relations between Japan and Russia. would it be possible for the territory dispute to accelerate coordination system in this area? Second one is, Dr. Chen emphasized on secretarial cooperation between Korea and Japan. How should the Korean government react or the escalation of military force in this area while tensions, they generating tension in this area? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, coordination in dealing with Russia and strengthening coordination among the three countries with an emphasis on the military side. I would say that this is a difficult thing because Seoul is primarily concerned about Russia's ties to North Korea and its support for reunification in principle and its support for the effort to pressure North Korea towards denuclearization. And then Japan has a situation where Abe's claim to his personal relationship with Vladimir, Shinzo Vladimir relationship, reminds me of what Trump said today about Putin. I mean, that there's sort of admires the man, and they're trying to create a strong personal linkage. Well, this is intended either for getting back islands, which many people are now doubting, or splitting Russia from China, which Russia keeps saying is not possible and it's not going to allow. So meanwhile, the U.S. and Japan have had a running disagreement. I'm not sure how much the tensions have risen at times or not over the possibility that Putin and Abe will meet in a serious way, and that the price for that meeting will be a Japan dropping out of the sanctions regime or doing something significantly to undermine the sanctions regime. And so far, that seems to be Russia's intention, and Japan doesn't want to do that. It would make a very difficult G7 meeting next year. And so all this talk about there's going to be some kind of deal and now Abe's going to go to Russia early next year is the plan before Putin comes to Japan. Well, that is all confusing and leading to a lot of uncertainty that isn't necessary for relationships. So I think that as the tensions with Russia have been very high in recent months, it's not been easy to coordinate these three countries. And when President Park is invited to go to the Sochi Olympic opening ceremony or to the Moscow May 9th 70th anniversary celebration and doesn't go, what are the Russian retaliation possibilities? Or when Prime Minister Abe doesn't go to the May 9th celebration and did go to the Sochi Olympics and now has made Putin angrier in recent months, what are the possibilities that Russia will do something, including establishing new military bases on the disputed islands and more air flights, more military planes flying next to Japanese space and trying to create a more hostile atmosphere with Japan. So there really is a real challenge in dealing with Russia collectively in this region. Sheila?
Well, the territorial, I think if I understood your question, do I think the territorial dispute is going to move forward? Is that correct? Is that your question? No, I'm not optimistic. But I don't have any inside information, so I could be completely in the dark. I think a lot of the ambition here in opening up a conversation with Putin, if you go back to the beginning, remember it wasn't just Abe, right? Prime Minister Noda was also engaging in some diplomacy with Moscow. I think as you saw the territorial dispute with South Korea flare up again, as you saw the Senkaku Diaoyu flare up again, I think the pressures or the desire to reopen a little bit of a push on knocking at the door on Moscow on the conversation with the territory was really pretty well founded across the foreign policy community in Japan. So I don't think they saw it as radical. I don't think it had to be, it was not tied to the G7 at that point in time. It was really a point of Japan had territorial disputes with all of its major allies, or major neighbors, and that was one opportunity that perhaps some diplomacy might help. Putin has, I think, has already done what Gil has outlined here. He's already put a lot of pressures on Japan. Not happy, of course, that Abe has postponed the state visit. He hasn't canceled it, he's postponed it, right? The foreign minister has met with the Russian foreign minister, so there has been high-level diplomacy. It's just the Abe-Putin, or the Putin visit to Tokyo that has been put on ice. Abe has met Putin at every international conference, right, in the interim, despite the G7. My basic view is that, our allies would have their own independent interests. I suspect that Japan's interests with Russia ought to be respected just a slight bit more here. Long-term energy interests with Russia. The territorial dispute is outstanding, and there's periodic efforts. Whether Putin's going to give the Japanese what they want on the islands, I'm very skeptical. But I don't think that means that the Japanese should stop trying. So I do think that there's a lot in it here that if you're sitting in Tokyo, that's a effort worth doing. I think the one piece of the outcome of the Putin-Abe interaction that I thought was interesting was the 2+2, the establishment of a 2+2. Now, does that mean that these two countries are strategic partners? No, but it gives them at least the optics that there are other potential partners in Northeast Asia other than China. And I think Putin needed those optics as much as Abe did, frankly. So they could make good use periodically of that 2+2. They could kind of signal to Beijing that they may be flirting with each other. I think it's just part of what's going on in Northeast Asia at the moment, the fluidity. And I think it's wise for the Japanese to do that, frankly. The Russians have now been sending bomber flights around Japan again. The scrambles against the Russians in the north are equal, if not higher, at times than the scrambles with the Chinese, and we forget that northern bound border with Russia is a serious defense priority for the Japanese, and it still will be. So again, I think they need that conversation open. Whether or not it will end up in territorial accommodation, I don't think so. I don't think the Russians are actually interested.
Okay. About your question about security cooperation between Korea and Japan, can you raise attention?
No, now is Japanese military trying to escalate their size of military. So how can the Korean government react to this?
Do you think Japan is able to increase the size of self-defense force?
So now you're on the spot.
There's a 1% limit still. They're spending, I think, below 1% of GDP on their defense. That's first. Second, actually, we have to study the fact. So demographically, if Japan is able to maintain the current level of force, who knows? I doubt. Well, Japanese young people want to serve in the army? No, I don't think so. There's very close Japan go for the technology-based armed forces very much, but it requires huge financial resource allocation. So Japan is suffering from the economic problems. I don't think Japan is in a position to increase its defense capability while they are claiming they are going to play more active role in the security area. So the concern I have, whether Japan is able to carry out what it says, that's the concern. Exactly opposite way around. Maybe in the media you see lots of, remilitarization of Japan, it's coming back again, all this. But actually we have to start the study of actual fact, and then we can say, of course there's a trend. If you read the narratives of some politicians in Japan, we have to concern, so old Japan, Imperial Japan is coming back. You can see. So there are politicians, they try to appeal. But I'm quite confident sound the Japanese public in resisting such narratives.
Yeah.
And of course, how South Korea should respond. So if you look at the statement made by foreign ministry, I speak like the foreign ministry's spokesperson. Anyhow, actually, that's a good one. So if you read the spokesperson's comment on collective self-defense right, say, so Japan should consult with South Korea when it intends to exercise collective self-defense right on the Korean Peninsula. That means, actually, if you read it carefully, recognize Japan's collective self-defense right, except on the Korean Peninsula, or conditionally recognize Japan's collective self-defense right. So we have overcome some kinds of emotional resistance in recognize the reality. So I think it's, so of course, you're from Asan, our institute, so you have to check the polling data. Public has become very much supportive towards security cooperation with Japan. I think majority of people recognize that it is necessary for South Korea have better relations with Japan, not only in the economy, but also in the security field. Actually, the word I like to use is security cooperation, not military cooperation. Security cooperation actually is much more actually broader than the military cooperation. If it comes to the military cooperation, you're talking about only mil to mil. If you're talking about security, it means go beyond the military. We are talking about partners in realizing the common goals and values as one. And actually, of course, before I conclude, I have to clarify one point. According to the Foreign Ministry, there is no territorial dispute between Japan and Korea.
Yes, question back there.
Thanks. Steve Luckett. I work and study here in the city. Thank you very much for the forum. Could any among the three, or all three of you, comment on remarks recently put to me by no less a light on Asia policy than Richard Armitage about, speaking of mill to mill, about United States Marine Corps and Japanese forces conducting joint operations in Southern California the past couple of years, and how that might alter for a combined defensive or offensive campaign in South Asia.
Sheila?
I can tag here. Just to clarify, it's Southeast Asia?
Southeast
Asia, right, okay. So as you know, and of course, as Secretary Armitage has talked about a lot, he's an advocate of greater combined operations between the Self-Defense Force and the U.S. military. The Japanese are just now beginning to develop an amphibious landing capability, right? That was stimulated in large part because of the island dispute. It's being run out of their ground self-defense forces, and the 3rd MEF, which is down in Okinawa, has been an observer and at sometimes participant in some of the exercises closer to home. So that's one area where Japan's own defense interests now are moving in the direction of a capability that Japan just didn't have before. So the U.S. Marine Corps that's in Okinawa can help with that considerably in terms of training and conceptualization. So that's one piece of the puzzle. When you want to move that off into Southeast Asia, first, I think the Japanese capability would have to be far greater to make it really plausible that they would operate together that way. I don't think there's going to be taking of islands in the South China Sea, for example, that the United States and Japan would then go in to defend. Japan would not have a defense interest. It doesn't have a claim in the South China Sea. Where I do see the Japanese now playing a larger role is not in the military sphere per se, but in the coastal defenses. It's working with the Philippines. Around Palawan Island about a month or two ago, the Japanese and the United States, not together, but first the Japanese and then the United States, had exercises, very small scale, very tiny scale, in terms of coastal defenses of Palawan. So that's, I think, where the Japanese contribution in Southeast Asia can be the greatest. The Japanese are donating Coast Guard ships, perhaps even search and rescue airplanes to Vietnam. We're not sure yet, but they're going to be helping Vietnam and other coastal states of Southeast Asia develop the capacity to be able to be more aware of what's happening in their own territorial waters, but also have a greater capability of dealing with it. But in the traditional military sense of, defending islands against an incursion, I don't think you'll find the Japanese self-defense forces will be defending Southeast Asian islands. That's my take on it.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Haiyang Lee from Asan Academy. I'd like to ask a question to Dr.
Dr. Smith. So you wrote a book about the dynamics of Japanese domestic politics in dealing with the rise of China.
I did. Thank you.
Is there any similar dynamics in Japanese politics vis-a-vis Korea? And I also have a question for Dr. Chen. Since Japan didn't recognize Korea's jurisdiction over the Korean Peninsula, only it's limited to the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, will this be an obstacle to Japan and South Korea's security cooperation?
So since you mentioned Intimate Rivals, I get to advertise Intimate Rivals. No, we did a book launch at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington for my book this year, and the entire audience asked about Japan, South Korea. Japan, China, not so much. Let's talk about Japan, South Korea.
No pressure to write another book, right?
I said that's my next book. But just intellectually, I actually enjoy whether it's the U.S. and Japan or it's Japan and China. I kind of gravitate towards how domestic politics affects foreign policy choice, and I intellectually I like it, and that's why I do a lot of my research specifically on Japan. You could absolutely write a book like that. I don't think it would be the same premise as I have in Intimate Rivals, right? And which is what stimulated me to write that book about Japan's response to a rising China was really obviously the Japanese and Chinese governments were increasingly having difficulty solving problems together. But I think as Professor Che just described, the Japanese and South Korean governments actually can solve all kinds of problems together. They just can't solve some of these intractable questions of particularly comfort women or history, historical legacy. So I don't think it's the same phenomenon if I were to guess about what that book might look like if I were to write that kind of book. But what I would like to write about if I could, and I'd need a partner in crime who understands South Korean domestic politics better than I, and can read Korean because I can't read Hangul, but would be that what I mentioned earlier, which is how embedded some of these issues have become domestically in both countries, and what that then means for the latitude of the governments to manage those issues or to resolve those issues. I think in the past, you had periods of political leadership, good and bad, perhaps. Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyung, I mean, whatever your values are about those leaders, they had the capacity to do things, right? Because they could carry some of their constituencies and advocacy groups at home. Whether you're going to have leaders in the future who can do similar things, I don't know, on the Japan-China side. I think, we who study Japanese politics look to the beyond Abe, and frankly, it's not clear to me who the next generation of political leaders are going to be in Japan, or if they're going to have the kind of political latitude that Abe seems to currently have. It's very questionable. South Korea, I'll defer to the South Korean experts in the room, but I think that's the kind of book I would like to write, is a comparison of the embeddedness in both sides and what that does then to government abilities to solve problems.
Okay, about your question about the recent Japanese position on this jurisdictional rights, it's nothing new. Japan has maintained the same position. So, of course, whether that could be an obstacle in carrying out cooperation in dealing with, for example, contingency in the Korean, I don't think so. Because it's a more political issue rather than the real military issue. Once we have such a situation, I'm quite confident there's a real cooperation between Korea and Japan. Of course, through the United Nations Command, a real area support. So Japan has been saying that, we have the role to play and responsibility as a real area force provider. All major forces will come through Japan. It is necessary to have Japanese cooperation, so of course. And we have to recognize, actually this is fact, of course, very controversial. Both Koreas are members of the United Nations. North Korea has, I don't know how many missions overseas they have, now they're more than 100. So if you come to Europe, they say, North Korea is independent sovereign state. That's the mood you can see in other parts of the world. Of course, we have our own constitution which says the Republic of Korea has a rights, Korean Peninsula and associated islands. That's our own rights. We have to keep claiming that. But on the other hand, we have to also see the different interpretations out there. So we have to take into account those differences and then try to overcome and get the support of international community for our own claims. Of course, that one of the base or rationale or the fact you can utilize, of course, the basic agreement of 1991. Both Korea actually recognize that relations is not a state-to-state relation. It's a special relations appeared in the process of gearing toward unification. I think that's the official translation. I think so. Special relations, not the state-to-state. That's the kind of relation between East and West Germany. They say all special relations. And also they recognize that, and they have never used the word unification. The West Germany has never ministry such as unification, but it's internal affairs ministry. That's the term they use. So emotionally we are very upset when the Japanese official said, oh, we can't accept the jurisdiction lines of South Korea based upon South Korea's constitution. That's nice news. But there's no obstacle in carrying out cooperation in dealing with North Korea's challenge on the Korean Peninsula.
Frank?
Frank Chinuzzi with the Mansfield Foundation. All of you have addressed the fact that South Korea and Japan view China through their own historical and geographic and cultural lens. With respect to the South China Sea, we see some of these differences playing out, and yet there also appears to be at least some convergence. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that in addition to Japan providing ships to the Philippines and Vietnam, that South Korea recently provided some naval vessels or Coast Guard vessels, I think, to Vietnam.
Yes.
Even though South Korea has been reluctant to be as fulsome in its rhetoric about what China is up to in the South China Sea. So I was wondering if any one of you or anyone who wants to weigh in could address the South China Sea either as a point of division or as a point of convergence of Japanese and South Korean security policy vis-a-vis China. Is this going to be an issue that tends to cause South Korea and Japan to drift apart over their interpretations of the threat posed by China's behavior? Or might it be an area of cooperation either explicitly or tacitly in helping to bolster the capability of these Southeast Asian nations to resist Chinese hegemony?
If you allow me to go first, actually, there could be two positions. One will be official, the other one is unofficial. The official position goes like this. Of course, we cannot say specifically, explicitly it's China. But we can say liberal international order, rule-based. So we can cooperate with Japan in safeguarding the rule-based international order at the regional level. That, I don't know whether that could be acceptable for Japan. I think that's the statement you can get from the governmental level. Of course, unofficially you can say we have a concern China, but we do not want to provoke China. We do not want to be being pushed by China. But South Korea has been pushed by China on several occasions already. So if South Korea is pushed by Chinese, I think that South Korea actually reacted. When, for example, the THAAD was the one issue, you can have some implication, draw some implication from that. When Chinese say, oh, South Korea should not allow USFK to deploy the THAAD, and then South Korea should not go for missile defense cooperation with the United States and Japan. Actually, for the first time, spokesperson with the Defense Ministry say, oh, that's not the matter of China to intervene. Explicitly, for the first time, I just welcome that. And also, after having such incident, the public approval, actual support for the THAAD system has gone up very much. I think more than 70% of the public supported it to the THAAD. So I think the U.S. actually managed that issue very well by keeping quiet. This kind of THAAD is more political than the military issue. So.
The question here also is trade-offs. The South China Sea is a big test for China, and China retaliates against countries that don't follow cross its red lines. And so if you think of North Korea and the South China Sea as the two multilateral challenges in the region, is there in some way a trade-off, a linkage? Does China do something in North Korea that makes South Korea angry because South Korea does something with the South China Sea, or South Korea strengthens its ties with Japan? And I think that we have to anticipate things. And also, when South Korea sees China doing some things with North Korea that it doesn't like, does South Korea then move more directly to challenge some of China's red lines? This seems to me the kind of analysis that everybody should be following closely.
Frank, it's a great question. I don't see convergence or division in terms of the positions. I see the larger picture, if you step back from Washington's point of view, of course, is collective action, right? How can we mobilize a coalition, and we don't all have to go marching through and do freedom of navigation, but how do we build capacity together? How do we support norms, frameworks of maritime stability? How do we think about when China does something, how do we respond in a way that's in consonance with international law, for example, UNCLOS. I don't think we've done enough. We talked about this earlier this week, but I don't think we've done enough yet to understand among the three countries we're talking about here what our positions are on UNCLOS, right? And there are differences, frankly. And so I think there's 2 points. One, the point that Gil made, I'll come back to in a second, which is China is quite good at looking at lateral connections and different kinds of trying to divide and conquer, perhaps, or at least cause a little bit of pressure here and a little bit of pressure there if it doesn't like behaviors elsewhere. But I think on this international law, especially on the maritime dimension, there's maybe a little work for the alliances to do, to understand better, because I think our three countries do actually interpret UNCLOS slightly differently. I think it's also true that freedom of navigation operations have largely been done by the United States in the past. We've even done it against Okinatorishima, and the Japanese, of course, are not very comfortable with that, but they're comfortable as long as we're doing it. But let's just say China decides to do a freedom of navigation in Okinatorishima, would not be so comfortable, right? So I think there's ways here that we ought to talk a little bit more carefully in the alliance relationships before we build up expectations on behavior. Let's make sure that we get a little bit more in-depth understanding on the legal, how we interpret these things, because actually they matter for the sovereignty disputes as well as for some of the EEZ differences that are going to emerge in the region. But Gil's point here about pressure here can result in pressure over there, and just in the East China Sea in the last couple of months, there's been a lot more Chinese activity. Nothing any egregious, no bad behavior in the sense that they've done something, but there's just more ships in the East China Sea. And the South China Sea conversation emerged, and Japan made a couple of statements about, ISR, and they are going to probably have a P1 or something in Singapore, it looks like, in terms of surveillance and reconnaissance as well. But the activity in and around by the Chinese Navy has upped in the East China Sea. Now, does that mean the Chinese Navy is about to do something in the Senkakus? Probably not.
Just the end of the typhoon season.
Yes, they're out, getting a little fresh air. I don't know, but there's all kinds of signaling that goes on without egregious behavior, and that's the kind of thing, of course, that people in Tokyo and Seoul are quite sensitive to. And we ought to, as Gil said, I said, draw little arrows here and there and make sure we're being observant.
Actually, this about the South China Sea issue nowadays. Actually, I've been here for 5 days, and then first what I heard from my American colleagues, rule-based international norms. So maybe Chinese will ask, what rules you are talking about? Can you give me a more specific definition of rules and norms you're talking? I think that's exactly the Sheila's point. Exactly, we must be much more clear on this concept and what we mean by norms and more in practical terms, in operational terms. So we have to operationalize these terms in a more practical sense and in action-oriented terms. About the trade-off, I think that we have to take a reverse approach. It is a kind of litmus test whether China can go along with us rather than have become a victim. So we do one thing and China do other thing and link it. So we have to think. We have to ask China to decouple or delink this issue. if they decide to couple, or they'll try to link these issues together as a kind of revenge, things like that, Chinese credibility will go down in toilet. So if they do the same thing as they did the garlic war between Korea and China, so the credibility of China will come down to the lowest level we can.
Question?
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. I'd like to go back to this whole question of the triangularity of the relationship. I think that's grossly overstated and really been overstated grossly in the last 3 to 4 years. There's security relationships between the U.S. and Japan and the U.S. and South Korea. And you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and you look at the relationships, they've always talked about two sides of a triangle. They've never talked about the third side, except to note that there are weaknesses in that area and they would like to see it strengthened. But there's never been, and I don't think there is now yet, an effort really to define a Japan-South Korea security relationship. And yet there's a lot of literature that talks about triangularity in a relationship and how we are so concerned about this. But I'm not sure that that's really the case. We can manage both alliances. We can manage the relationships, the strategic implications of those alliances without a Japan-South Korea defense, if that were to emerge. It hasn't yet emerged, and I think it's largely because South Korea isn't really ready to emerge as an independent factor. They are still pretty much tied to the confrontation with the North. And that's going to limit their ability to want to interact with a Japan who thinks of the Korean Peninsula as having two states on that peninsula, how China looks at Korea, two states on the peninsula, and how the U.S. looks at the Korean Peninsula. There's a reluctance, I think, on the part of South Koreans to recognize that fact. There's also a difference in the domestic politics of South Korea to really come to terms with their own history, how they emerged as an independent republic and come to grips with their own internal oppression and suppression that's gone on for decades and is represented now by the current president.
I'm
So
sure.
those issues really have to be addressed simply on the Korean side before you begin to talk about how Japan and South Korea might begin to form a real basis for a relationship independent of the United States. The United States has only been around 100, 200 years. Japan and Korea have been next to each other for 1,400.
Thank you for bringing our attention right back to the triangular theme. I don't think when we were talking about triangularity, we were talking about an equilateral triangle. So one can discuss
There's no
it.
triangle.
And you're saying there's no triangle.
Yeah.
Well, some people talk about a virtual triangle. Some people say there's more need for triangularity now than there was before because of the defensive concerns relating to North Korea and because of shared interests relating to China and because of the danger of real troubles between Japan and South Korea interfering with the other two legs of the triangle. So really these are a set of questions about a triangle rather than an assumption that a full-fledged triangle of a sort of equilateral nature exists. But I'm sure others have comments here too.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't prescribe a triangle, certainly not an equidistant one, but I do think there's some obvious connections in terms of what Professor Che was talking about earlier, which is the security on the peninsula. The UN-based command structure depends on the Japanese support, logistical support. The bases in Japan, the UN bases in Japan will be crucial for any kind of Korean contingency. So there are connections here that are critical. I think Japan and Korea have for a very long time had a very strong economic and social relationship. I think we talk about these issues as if the whole relationship has broken down. It hasn't, right? Although you can see, and I wrote in that article that I wrote last year, some of the directional arrows on FDI had changed because of the political tensions. I don't know yet whether those have gone back up or not. So But I think, you know, I hesitate to sort of say that the relationship between Japan and Korea is broken. It doesn't exist. That's not true either, right? But one of the things that I think, you know, whether we use triangle or trilateral, I mean, trilateral is who's sitting at the table to talk about issues. And I think for each of there are many trilaterals in Northeast Asia that are worth thinking about. The one we didn't talk about here, because we're talking about Japan, Korea, U.S., is the other one that got started again lately, the more tender and fragile one, which is Japan, South Korea, China. And we finally got back to the point where the leaders could meet. And I think that's actually one of the more important trilaterals to think about in Northeast Asia, in addition to this one that we're talking about today. I personally feel that the time has come to formalize a trilateral between Japan, China, and the United States. Because I think there's just some issues here, both of the alliance and of China's concern about the alliance and vice versa, that we're going to have to talk about in that venue as well. But there's, you know, and South Korea has begun to advocate for a Korea, U.S., China trilateral. So I wouldn't fix these geometries as having meaning or being exclusive of the others, right?
Actually, ideally, we'd like to have trilateral.
Yeah.
One, Korea, Japan, U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
Korea, China, U.S.
Mm.
Korea, China, U.S. is going to be more diplomatic efforts
Yeah.
in solving the North Korean nuclear problem. But Korea, Japan, U.S. is more security-oriented
Right.
one. But actually, your point could be taken seriously. But actually, there's one fact which actually requires that the trilateral actually has made a trilateral security cooperation more meaningful. That's the changing nature of North Korean threat.
Yeah.
North Korea used to be stay in the Korean Peninsula, even go beyond the Korean Peninsula. Now, actually, Japan has become the direct subject of North Korean threat. So if Japan takes unilateral action vis-a-vis North Korea, that would affect South Korea's security very much. So there's a linkage among these three countries than ever before, much more close linkage. Second factor maybe because changing nature of North Korean threat, so we have to think about more options in hand. But trilateral things could provide us more options in responding back to North Korean threat. Just I'm saying that's one example why we should have trilateral. Necessity is over there. The effectiveness of our response. Of course, we can respond back by bilateral basis, U.S. allocate, but to ensure the sufficient level or credibility of our response, it might be better to have our back.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, with contributors like these to the journal, we could not go wrong. And so I'm just delighted to be with them on the panel, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much.